Greetings, everybody. Thanks for coming back for another session here. I've got another message that kind of fits within the same layout as our first message, the Kidron Saga. In the Kidron Saga, I tried to show you prophetic history and also the prophetic hope that we have, all wrapped up in that word Shekan, if you remember that. And so as we looked at it, we looked at a lot of passages throughout the scriptures. You know, it's funny because I often hear people, they'll say things like 1/3 of the Bible is prophecy. And I understand what they're saying, but I think that's a miscalculation. The whole book of the whole Bible itself is a prophetic book. And here's the reason why, because see, God doesn't just speak prophecy in the moments of the prophetic text. Whether it's a prophet like Ezekiel speaking, or Zechariah, or Isaiah, or when there's a prophet speaking, or when the Apostle Paul speaks certain prophetic truth, kind of wrapped up in his epistle, or when Jesus is standing on the Mount of Olives and he's, sharing with us the Olivet Discourse. What I'm trying to get at here is that those are all very important prophetic moments in the scriptures. But the entire Bible is driving us prophetically forward. That's the whole point of the Bible. I believe the Bible, the whole thing is prophetic, from the narrative portions of the Bible to the prophetic and poetic texts. All of it is prophecy driving us forward to know God more fully and to know what his plan is. And so I want to show you what I mean by that today, because we're going to focus it on actually a narrative portion of the text that becomes incredibly foundational to our prophetic hope and the prophetic truth that we have in the scriptures, and that a lot of the prophets of the Old Testament, and I believe a lot of the words of the apostles in the New Testament, are all going to ground themselves in as we look at this message that I've titled The Common Thread. And so again, remember, when we're talking about the Bible, it's stunning to think, oh my goodness, people, the Bible's 1/3 prophecy and people don't study the prophetic text. I would say the whole Bible is prophetic. Just remember something. Right from the moment that Adam and Eve disobeyed God in Genesis chapter 3 in the fall, God issues from that narrative portion of text, from that account that happened between Adam, Eve, Satan, and God. From that, God puts forth a prophecy in Genesis chapter 3. He puts forth a prophecy of redemption, how God would redeem everything. And it becomes the proto-evangelicum, the very first gospel in Genesis chapter 3, verses 15 and 16, as it will drive the prophetic text forward. But notice where that comes from. The prophecy that God sets forth, the very first prophecy in Genesis 3:15 and 16, it comes from a narrative portion of the text. It comes from the story, the account of Adam, Eve, and Satan and God and their relationship, and how it was severed because of deception and severed because of disobedience. And so again, these narrative portions, like I'm going to show you, are going to drive prophetic text because the entire scriptures from Genesis to Revelation are progressive revelation. That's why it's very difficult for people. When you only read the New Testament, it's difficult to understand the New Testament if you don't have a basis in the Old Testament as well. You can't have a New Testament without the Old Testament. They are dependent on one another. The Old Testament is foundational to the New Testament, or else what's the point? Why is this guy Jesus even coming? Who is he? What's he doing? Even the apostles, when they are speaking truth about who Jesus is, what are they doing? They're relying on the Old Testament text to give meaning to who Jesus is and why he is the Messiah of Israel. But that's enough of me yapping. Let me get to my message here, the common thread. And let me make sure I can open this up to full screen so that you can see that. Hello, everybody. There we go. The common thread. Let me just share a few things before we move forward. I hope that you get the opportunity soon, not now, but in the near future, to go to foiequip.org. I'll show you that website again in a moment, to listen to the Jew and Gentile podcast. If you enjoy God's prophetic word, if you love studying the Bible and learning more about really Jewish culture and customs, understanding the Bible from a Jewish perspective, which I think is incredibly important, then I want you to listen to the Jew and Gentile podcast. That's my boss there. Maybe you know him. His name is Steve Herzig. He's the vice president of North American Ministries with the Friends of Israel. And I serve alongside Steve. Of course, that's me over there. My beard was a little bit shorter at that time, but check out the Jew and Gentile podcast. Hey, I got another one for you too, okay? Listen, if you're here right now and you are enjoying the Last Days Prophecy Conference, then that means that you like studying the scriptures. I really believe that. And so if you want to learn more about how you can study the scriptures from a Jewish perspective, then you can start your journey today with the Friends of Israel by signing up for our newsletter at foiequip.org. And what this will get you is free access to all of our online classes. We have a plethora of classes that we're running all year long that teach about Israel, teach about prophecy, teach about modern Israel, what's going on in Israel today. You name it, we do the Feasts of Israel, Jewish culture and customs. We teach on anti-Semitism and the Holocaust. All of these things are happening constantly. In fact, on May 11th, I will begin my class on Israel's independence and their leaders. It'll be a 3-week class. It's just 3 sessions, Thursday nights at 7:30 p.m. Eastern time. And you can register for these classes, all available for free at foiequip.org. They're online. We have a community of believers from all around the world who join us. We love it. So not only can you get access to the Jew and Gentile podcast right here at foiequip.org, but you can also sign up for my class that I'll be doing and other classes in the future. In June, we're going to have Dr. Mordecai Kadar, a Bar Ilan University in Tel Aviv professor, who's going to be speaking about the 6-Day War. That's when the 6-Day War happened, was in June. So again, go to foiequip.org, sign up, put your email address in, and you'll get information about ways that you can connect with Friends of Israel through foiequip, the Bible from a Jewish perspective. All right, so I want to take you to what I think is one of the most incredibly foundational texts in the Bible, and often overlooked, but foundational. And the reason it's foundational is because it is really going to drive what's going on in the scriptures. And I'm going to show you exactly what I mean. I want to link it all together for you here. But if you ever notice when you're reading through Genesis 1 through 11, that should be a book all by itself. We're talking about the creation story, the fall, and then God working through individuals like Noah to try to, kind of, I don't want to use the word reinvent, but to bring judgment to the earth for mankind falling away from God, forgetting God, and then he chooses Noah as the person to save mankind and to restart almost. And then the story of how we end up with multiple languages and the dispersion of man. All of this spread of time is wrapped up in just 11 chapters. And then all of a sudden you get to chapter 12 and everything changes. It moves from this fast pace, God said it was good in creation, all the way to, Terah. In just 11 chapters, Terah was the father of Abraham, in just 11 chapters. And then all of a sudden we enter into the story, we enter into the account of this one individual named Abram. And here's what I think God is doing. Of course, the truth of creation, the truth of how we are where we are today, how mankind came to be, God's creation, all of it is wrapped up in Genesis 1 through 11, but that becomes a vehicle. It becomes a medium in order to get us to this one verse right here. I honestly believe that. I believe that all of it is driving us Genesis 1 through 11 is driving us to this individual moment, to this individual that God is going to call, to this individual in order to bring about redemption. And that is why prophecy is going to be built. God's prophetic word is going to be built on these verses and the subsequent verses that we're going to see as well. But let me read it for you really quick. Out of nowhere in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, as we've been tracking along through the genealogy from Genesis 1 through 11, as we get to this individual named Abram, God calls Abram, and all of a sudden time slows down. If you're watching Genesis like a movie, Genesis 1 through 11 will move really fast, and then all of a sudden time slows down, and we're focusing, we're devoting ourselves to this one individual here, Abram. And look what it says. It says this: go from your country, Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. Abram, go from your country and your relatives and your father's household to a land that I will show you. And then I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, so that you will exemplify divine blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and the one who treats you lightly, I must curse, so that all of the families of the earth may receive blessing through you. This is a promise that God made to Abram. Abram was living in Ur of the Chaldees, which, if you follow the track of Mesopotamia, it goes down the Euphrates River. You follow that all the way down, and you'll into the southern areas of Iraq, and you'll land in an area called Ur, a city called Ur. Abram was a pagan, and his dad was a pagan, and his family were pagans. Joshua tells us this. You don't read about this in Genesis, but in the book of Joshua, Joshua says that our ancestors that date back to Abraham have pagan roots, but that God would call Abram out, and give him a promise that has three components to it. And I really believe if you get these three components down, it will help you read and understand the scriptures more fully. Notice the first one. I'm going to, if you leave and you follow me, you step out in faith, and you listen to my voice, and you follow me, you leave your country, your relatives, and your father's household, which is a big deal, everybody. In today's modern era, can I tell you something? It's very normal for individuals to leave in our individualistic societies and culture that we live in. I grew up in my family's house, in the Katulka house, with my mom and my dad and my sisters. And then you know what I did? I packed my bags when I turned 24, and I moved to Dallas, Texas, where I went to Dallas Theological Seminary, and I met my wife there, and we started a family in Dallas. And I'm going to tell you something. I packed up and I moved from the world that I knew. And I left, but that's very normal in society today, in especially in Western society, but in Western culture. But in the ancient Middle Eastern world, and in the ancient Near East, you didn't leave your family's house. Maybe you left to go find your wife or your spouse, but you brought them back, and you would actually even build onto your family's house. So they do that today in a lot of Arab Muslim communities in Israel. When you go, you'll see, especially when you go north towards Syria and Lebanon and Israel, you'll see that the families build houses on, you'll have the mom and dad, but the mom and dad built their home connected to the grandpa and grandma. And then what happens is the son and daughter, they build daughter-in-law will build a home connected. And it looks like this huge mansion, but there's multiple families living in them, because you don't leave your family. This was a big deal that God is calling Abram to leave the country he knew, the relatives he knew, and even his father Terah's household. And notice what he says: I'm going to take you to a land that I will show you. So number one, land. I'm giving you land. That's what God promises Abram, land. That's really important. Okay. He promises him land. The next one, and I'll show you, I wanted to flip to make sure I had them all lined up there for you. The next one, look at, God says, I will make you into a great nation. And this becomes important. You're going to have descendants. Everybody that would come from you would be the seed of you, the descendants of you will become your nation. I'm going to make you into a great nation, and which promised Abram that had no children, a son. And so I will make you into a great nation. There will be descendants that come from you. So people, so you have land, you have descendants and people that will come from you, Abram, and I will bless you. Now, this becomes a multifaceted blessing. It's not just, oh, bless you there, Abraham, go on your way now. No, this becomes a multifaceted blessing. So first of all, we're talking about a land, which would become the land of Israel. Number two, we're talking about people, individuals that would make up a great nation for Abram. These would become the Israelites, the sons of Israel, or eventually the Jewish people. And I will bless you, it says, and I will make your name great. So the multifaceted blessing. Number one, I will make your name great. And just to let you know, here we are, nearly 4,500 years after this promise was given to Abraham. And what are we doing? We're talking about Abram's blessing. And so the fact that we're still talking about Abraham is an amazing thing, because we're remembering his name, which gives honor to who he is, and we're saying he was a man that was blessed. So here we are 4,500 years later, and his name is still a great name, just as God promised. And look at, you will exemplify divine blessing, which means that, whenever your name is spoken, it will be associated with blessing. That's a good thing to have too. Okay, I like this. My reputation, as God says to Abram, will be associated with blessing. And look at this. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who treats you lightly, I must curse. Now, some of your translations in Genesis 12, 1 through 3, and you probably know this verse, I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. The word curse there is actually two different Hebrew words. The first Hebrew word actually isn't the idea of cursing, that someone has to come up and curse you. You'll be a cursing, put a curse on this person, or you judge them with cursing, that kind of thing. No, that's not what the Hebrew word is communicating here. The Hebrew word for the first curse is actually, if you take this lightly. So if anybody takes this promise that God is making to Abram lightly, then God will curse them. So think about it. It's not just the fact that people are going to curse Abram and his family or his descendants and the nation. It's that if anybody even takes it lightly, they will be cursed. Think about that. And that's why I love this translation, because it highlights that Hebrew word. The one who treats you lightly, I must curse. So that, why? Now there's another component to the blessing, which gives the purpose for why God calls Abram. And look what it says. Abram, I'm calling you, because remember, I said that the Genesis 1 through 11, it kind of acts like a funnel that comes down to get us to this individual Abram. So from creation down to Genesis 1 to Genesis 12 moves us like a funnel to focus in on this one guy, Abram. And then all of a sudden the funnel opens back up again. It kind of goes like this, down to Abram and then back open again. Why? Because notice the divine purpose that God gives Abram here. This is what's so important. A lot of people, we call the Jewish people God's chosen people. But chosen, when you hear chosen, I think this is so funny. When you hear chosen, you think it's some elitist group. Oh, excuse me, you're chosen by God. Excuse me, I'm sorry, that I would even bug you, or that you'd even have time. Thank you for having time for me, chosen people. Or it's some inclusive group, like exclusive group. Thank you, we're God's chosen. You stay over there, we'll be over here. That is not at all what God was trying to communicate by choosing Abram. Look what he says. I'm going to give you a blessing. Your name will be a blessing, and I'm going to protect you, so that if anybody even treats this promise lightly, I'm going to curse them. So your name's going to be a blessing. I'm going to protect you, Abram. And let me say this, you have a purpose. And the purpose is what flings that funnel that comes down to Abraham back open again. Okay? Abram, through you and your family, all the families of the earth will be blessed. so that the families of the earth may receive blessing through you. Okay, this becomes important because it's always been about God using Abram, giving him a divine purpose to bring blessing to every nation, to every tribe, to every tongue. That's the whole point of this, is that they're chosen for a divine purpose. People, again, they this exclusive to Jewish people, the chosen people, excuse me. Can I tell you something? When I was growing up, my dad would often choose me, the chosen one, to take the garbage out or clean up the dog's mess in the backyard. Okay. Being chosen isn't always the most exciting thing to be chosen. I used to lament being chosen to take the garbage. Oh, God. Oh, not God, I'm sorry. Oh, Dad. Oh, Dad, why did you choose me to take the garbage out? Can't you choose my sister? Or why did you choose me to do this job? It's not what I wanted to do. And yet God, in choosing Abram, gives him a divine purpose. And this is why I think the Fiddler on the Roof does a fantastic job of showing what it means to be God's chosen people. When Tevye cries out to God as he's dealing with his daughters and the fact that they're embracing the world and they're leaving his culture behind, and they're marrying Gentile individuals, and he's trying to uphold the values of the Jewish people, to be God's chosen people. And what does he do? He cries out to God, couldn't you have chosen someone else? Couldn't you choose someone else for a moment? Why'd you have to choose us? Couldn't you pick somebody else to do this job? Well, it's because it's a heavy responsibility that God's going to give to Abraham and his descendants to be the bearers of redemption. Through you, Abram, all the families of the earth will be blessed. So again, let's follow through with this. Remember this. If you can remember these 3 points, it becomes very helpful in the way that you understand the Bible as a whole, but also as you understand prophecy. So number 1, look at, what did God promise Abram? A land. What did God promise Abram? Descendants. And eventually he promises him a blessing. But something happens along the way. When you go to this next section, is called God turns Abraham's promise into Abraham's covenant. Okay. This goes from a promise to a covenant. And so I want you to see something here, because when you go to Genesis chapter 12 in verse 15, it's very fascinating, because it says this in Genesis chapter 12, verse 15, it says, "So the Lord said to him, bring me a heifer." Now, first, let me get started here. Actually, let me go to the scripture so I can give some more context to this. God calls Abram. Abraham steps out in faith and goes to the land that God would show him. So he goes to the land of Israel, and he begins to plant himself in the land. So he gets the land. He's been protected. Okay. And there's a blessing. He's being blessed by God. All of these things are very, very, very important. And so God does all of these things. And now what happens is, as Abraham is in the land, something happens. There's a moment where Abram begins to question God. He questions him because he's got the land. He definitely feels blessed, but he's missing a component to the promise. And the component is his son. And so that becomes very, very important because he's wondering, you promised me land, you promised me a blessing, but now I'm missing a part of this promise, a big part, which is an heir to the promise that you made to me. And so look what it says. In Genesis chapter 15, starting in verse 1, it says, "After these things, the Lord's message came to Abram in a vision. 'Fear not, Abram, I am your shield and the one who will reward you in great abundance.' But Abram said, 'O sovereign Lord, what will you give me, since I continue to be childless? You've brought me this far, I followed you this far, and yet I'm still missing this component. My heir is Eliezer of Damascus.' And Abram added, 'Since you have not given me a descendant, then look, one born in my house will be my heir.' But look, the Lord's message came to him. This man will not be your heir, but instead a son who comes from your own body will be your heir. So here, Abram is concerned, everybody. Abram is concerned. The promise will not be fulfilled. He's missing a major component of it. If you were to break it up into thirds, land, descendants, blessing, he's missing a whole third of this promise. The fact that he would have a son that would carry this inheritance, that would carry this promise forward. And he's questioning God. He's saying, God, you know, you promised me this stuff and you haven't given it to me. The person who will inherit this is this individual Eliezer of Damascus. It's interesting because scholars will actually say that if somebody passed away and they didn't have a son to give the inheritance to, it could go to his assistant or slave son, or that individual to receive the inheritance. So that's what some people think Eliezer of Damascus could have been, was this person that was a servant of Abram. And he goes, look at right now, the way things stand, this promise, that this inheritance that you're giving to me, God, this promise that you're giving to me is not going to me and my descendants. It's going to this individual right here, Eliezer. And God says, hey, calm down for a moment. You will have a son that will be your son. And then look what it says here. This is what's really important. He says, the Lord took him outside and said, gaze into the sky and count the stars if you are able to count them. And then he said to him, so will your descendants be. I promise you that. In fact, look what it says. Abram believed the Lord, and the Lord credited it to him as righteousness. So Abram believed. He believed in God and believed that he would have a son that would come from him. And in believing, God considered him in his faith righteous. This becomes such a foundational verse in the New Testament for the Apostle Paul to show that it's faith, that in faith in what God is doing. For the Apostle Paul, when he's talking to us, faith in the work, in the ministry, in the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ, faith in that makes you righteous, not your works. And so that becomes very important, because Abram just simply believed God, and then boom, he was considered righteous. But I want you to see something here. Watch what happens when it goes on. It says, the Lord said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldees to give you this land to possess. But I want you to see something, because this is what I love about the Bible. So Abram has this amazing moment of faith. I believe God. And God says, you are righteous in my eyes because of your faith in what I'm going to do. But then watch what happens. Abram asks a question. He says, I'm going to give you this land. And then Abram says, how will I know? I love this. People, can I tell you something? If you're still trekking with me here, this is why I love the Bible. You know, if the Bible were fake, can I tell you what Abram would do? He would have believed God a long time ago and never questioned God. But here, the Bible shows us the humanity. It shows us the deep spiritual faith that Abram has. And then at the same time, it shows us the humanity of Abram. Because I think Abram and us were a lot alike in many ways, in a lot of ways. God, I believe, but how will I know? That's faith and doubt right next to one another. You don't have to go but a verse or two, and you go from Abraham's great faith, a verse that the Apostle Paul will use foundationally for Gentiles believing in Jesus, the Messiah. You can read all about it in Paul's letters. It's just the most beautiful thing that Paul uses, that our righteousness is in Christ, not in ourselves, by believing in him and having faith in him and trusting in him. And then all of a sudden, but it's funny, the Apostle Paul leaves this moment out, all of a sudden Abram doubts. And that's when God takes this promise and turns it into a contract. You doubt? Let me show you something, Abram. Watch this. He says, the Lord said to him, verse 9, bring me a heifer, a goat, a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. And Abram brought all these things to him, cut them in two, and arranged the halves opposite each other. The birds, however, he did not cut in half. So here's what's interesting. This is what I love about the Bible. And, you know, people in the 21st century, they're trekking along with the story of Abram. They understand his story of stepping out in faith, coming to a land, trusting in God. And then all of a sudden, God tells him to do this weird thing. Bring me a heifer, a goat, a ram, 3 years old, along with doves and a pigeon. And you know what? Abram knew exactly what to do. And it says that Abram took all these things and he cut them in two and placed each half opposite the other. Abram doesn't even have to be told what to do at this point, because Abram knows, because it's an ancient ritual. And look at, this is in verse 10, that he placed them each opposite the other, but he did not cut the birds in half. When the birds of prey came down on the carcasses, Abram drove them away. So Abram is actually fulfilling an amazing thing here. It's actually an ancient custom. That's why he knew he was picking up on something here. Bring me these animals. He brings them, and now Abram knows what's going on, because God is making a contract, a covenant. He's going to cut a covenant with Abraham, literally cut, because he's gonna, you see what it says? He's splitting these animals in two, and he's arranging them opposite one another. He's cutting them in half. That's why we call it cutting a covenant. And look at what happens here in verse 12. When the sun went down, Abram fell sound asleep. Great terror overwhelmed him. And then the Lord said to Abram, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a foreign country. They will be enslaved and oppressed for 400 years. And this is talking about the fact that they'd be in Egypt for 400 years, but that God was still going to act even though they were in Egypt. Verse 17, when the sun had gone down and it was dark, a smoking fire pot with a flaming torch passed between the animal parts. That day the Lord made a covenant, cut a covenant with Abram. To your descendants I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates River, the land of the Kenites, Kenizzites, Kedemites, Hittites, Perizzites, Rephaites, Amorites, Canaanites, Girgashites, and Jebusites. God gives Abram this land in a contract. You know, the thing that's amazing about this contract, look, I forgot to move forward, but this is another part of the verse here. And so God makes this covenant with Abram. And now here's what's interesting is that when Abram brings those pieces, this is the ancient ritual. In the ancient day, in Abraham's time in the ancient Near East, when somebody would sell a plot of land to another person, or give a plot of land, or sell something to them, they would enter into a contract, and they would get these animals like a bull, and they would split them in half. And then the two individuals, the buyer and the seller, would walk through the pieces together, signifying something, signifying that if somebody breaks this promise, we've made the arrangements, we've made the deal, we've set up the tenets of this agreement, now we're going to make the contract. Now what's happening is they are walking through those pieces together as a sign that each one must fulfill their end of the bargain, whether they're going to pay a certain amount of money or make sure that there's certain territorial boundaries and they're not going to rip each other off, those kind of things, the deals in a contract. You know, it's the equivalent of a mortgage. I mean, if you've ever signed a mortgage to buy a home, it's not an easy process. You're signing your life away. You know, you give a couple kids, you know, away, you give, you know, you're basically saying, you know, you can have everything of mine if I don't fulfill this promise. It's a promise. It's a contract that you're making with the bank. Well, this is an ancient contract. And those two people, when they would walk through the pieces together, were saying, we agree to the tenets of this deal. We agree to the tenets of how this contract will work. However, if somebody breaks the contract, doesn't fulfill their end of the bargain, they end up like this animal, split in two. Okay? This is what they're trying to show. We'll take everything from you. You're making a promise. What's interesting about this situation with Abram is that it wasn't God and Abram walking through the pieces together. Look at, when the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking fire pot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. And on that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram. And he says, this is the land and the boundaries that I'm giving to you. But what's amazing is that Abraham did not walk through the pieces. Only God walked through the pieces. Abram was asleep. It was only God who walked through the pieces together. Or, I'm sorry, walked through the pieces alone. You know, there's two ways that you can look at this. The first way is that God blesses Abram by giving him the land, and only God is the one who walks through the pieces, which means Abram becomes the tenant in the land, and God is the landowner. The other way to look at this promise too is that what you're doing is when those two people would walk through those pieces to make a contract together, they were essentially cursing each other. If you don't fulfill this promise, I get to curse you because you're not living up to your end of the bargain. Well, guess what? God essentially puts a curse on himself. If I don't live up to the tenets of this promise that I'm making to Abraham, to give him the land that I promised and to fulfill the promise that I made to Abraham, then the curse is on me, on God alone. And so God walks through the pieces of this contract alone. Abram is asleep. Now, I want you to see something, because what's going to happen is that this means it moves from a conditional promise. It moves from a promise that is kind of tied to Abraham, and it moves out of the realm of the of not even conditional, but more, it moves out of the earthly realm and moves into the eternal realm. You know, because God's name is the one on the contract, because it's God who walked through the pieces, not Abram, because the moment Abram walked through the pieces, then guess what? It becomes Abram's promise with God and God's promise and covenant with Abram. Because Abram wasn't in it, it was only God who walked through the pieces. Now it moves from a contract, a covenant made with Abram, to just an eternal covenant connected to God's plan of redemption. And that becomes very, very important to see, because that is why in this next section, we're going to see the course of this covenant, because it doesn't just rest with Abram. I made this little chart for you here so that you can see about the significance of this promise. This promise is a common thread that binds the Bible together. And that's why it's connected to biblical prophecy, because I'll show you in a moment. But as you're constantly looking back over Israel's history, you know, you sit there and go, God should have left Israel a long time ago. Why didn't he do it? Well, it's all rooted in this promise. It doesn't just stay static with Abram. It continues to move throughout the scriptures, because remember, Abram did not walk through those pieces. It was God alone, and God made it an eternal, unconditional promise that can't be broken, because it's God's name connected to the land. It's God's name connected to the descendants. It's God's name connected to the blessing. That's important. Look at what happens. Abram, who becomes Abraham, if you've heard me jump back and forth with his name, he moves on. He dies. Listen to Genesis chapter 26. Listen to the similarities here in the covenant process. In Genesis chapter 26, verse 3, it says this. He's talking to Isaac now. God speaks to Isaac. Abraham dies. Now watch what happens with Isaac in Genesis chapter 3. God says to Isaac, stay in this land. Then I will be with you and I will bless you. For I will give all these lands to you and to your descendants. Again, see the components: land, descendants, blessing. And I will fulfill the solemn promise I made to your father Abraham. I will multiply your descendants so that they will be as numerous as the stars in the sky. And I will give them all these lands. All the nations of the earth will pronounce blessing on one another using the name of your descendants. And all this will come to pass because Abram obeyed me, kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, my laws. And so Isaac settled in Gerar. So here's the thing. Abram stepped out in faith, followed God. He did obey the commands, but also the big thing is that it was God's name on the contract. So it moves, the inheritance, the promise, the covenant moves from Abram now to Isaac. And it will also, jump with me once Isaac dies in Genesis chapter 28, verses 13 and 14. Listen to what it says here in Genesis 28, 13 and 14. It says, and the Lord stood at its top and he said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of your father Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the ground on which you are lying. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out west, east, north, south, so all the families of the earth may receive blessing through you and your descendants. I am with you. I will protect you. I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. I will protect you wherever you go and bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I promised you. The promise goes from Abraham, Isaac, to Jacob. And notice all three tenets of the promise are mentioned as the inheritance that God promised. Abraham moves to Isaac and then to Jacob. Land, descendants, blessing. And in that blessing, a blessing that your name would be great, a blessing of protection, and a blessing that all the families of the earth would receive blessing through Abraham and his descendants. Do you see how you trek along there? Watch how serious it gets, because in Genesis chapter 50, look at this. In Genesis chapter 50, at the very end of the Bible, Joseph, Genesis chapter 50, it says this in verses 22. Joseph lived in Egypt along with his father's family. Joseph lived 110 years. Joseph saw the descendants of Ephraim to the third generation. He also saw the children of Machir, the son of Manasseh. They were given special inheritance rights by Joseph. Then Joseph, listen to this. Then Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die, but God will surely come to you and lead you up from this land to the land he swore on oath to give Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Joseph made the sons of Israel, swear on an oath. He said, God will surely come to you. Then you must carry my bones from this place. So Joseph died at the age of 110. And after they embalmed him, his body was placed in a coffin. Joseph, think about this. Joseph knew the reality of the promise that God made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And it was so real and so palpable that even though he was second in command and had the greatest reputation in Egypt up to this point, what happens? He says, this isn't where we're supposed to be. This isn't the land. In fact, when God leads you to the land that he promised Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which carries on to this day, you're going to take my bones with you. You're going to exhume my bones and bury me in the land that God promised our people. Why? Because it's built on an eternal promise. And you know what? You might think, oh, that's nice. That promise stays in Genesis. No. Look at in the Torah as we continue on, it continues on. Look at in Exodus chapter 22, verses 24 and 25 at the very end here. Listen to what it says. Moses appears on the scene. Remember, now they've been in Egypt for 400 years. Moses appears on the scene, and look what it says. In Exodus chapter 2, verses 24 and 25, it says, God heard the groaning, their groaning. That's the Israelites' groanings of slavery and being in bondage for so long. God heard their groaning. God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob, and God saw the Israelites and God understood. This doesn't mean that God forgot the Israelites. It means that God's now about to act. You know, do you ever wonder why Moses even exists? Why did God choose Moses? Why did God use him in this moment in the book of Exodus? It wasn't just to bring them out of Egypt, and it wasn't just to give them the law. Those are major moments. And to build the tabernacle. Those are all big things that Moses did for the people of Israel. What's amazing is that Moses appears, God calls Moses. Why? Because he remembered the covenant that he swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Moses was supposed to lead the people of Israel right into the land that God promised them. Of course, they took detours because of their disobedience, but God called Moses to fulfill the promise that God made to Abraham. The promise where God walked through the pieces. You can read about that in Leviticus chapter 26, verse 42. It goes on. Deuteronomy 9:5. I love this one. Listen, Deuteronomy 9:5. You have to hear this because it's all connected to this promise. Deuteronomy 9:5 says this. Deuteronomy 9:5 says, it's not because of your righteousness, Israel, or even your inner uprightness that you have come here to possess the land. Instead, because of the wickedness of these nations, the Lord your God is driving them out ahead of you in order to confirm the promise he made on oath to your ancestors, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Do you hear that? You know, Israel, you're not this righteous group of people that deserve this land and this promise that God has made to Abraham, but it's because of the eternal nature, the unconditional eternal nature of this promise that now God is going to lead you, even as you're not even in your righteousness, but because of a promise that I swore to Abraham, I will lead you into the promised land to fulfill what I promised. Deuteronomy 9:5, you should read it. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's connected to the oath and promise he swore to them. That's why he's going to do it. Look in 2 Kings 13:23, it says the same thing. Israel should have been destroyed long ago because of their disobedience by God, but God remains faithful to Israel and the Jewish people. Why? Because of the oath and promise he swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Micah 7:20, a prophet who's prophesying the hope that Israel has in the future, the bright hope amidst all the judgment that's going on, amidst all their sin. All of a sudden, there's this bright hope that God would restore what he had promised to Israel. Why? Because of the oath and promise that he swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Read it. Actually, you know what? I'm going to read it for you really quick because I think it's that important. Micah says it very well there in the end in Micah chapter 7, verse 20. Listen to what it says here. I got to find, of course, I have to find this minor prophet now as I'm thumbing through. Here we go. Micah chapter 7, verses 20. Listen to what it says here. It's very important. Micah chapter 7, verse 20. You will be loyal to Jacob. Micah speaking to God. You will be loyal to Jacob. I'm confident, Micah is saying, you will be loyal to Jacob and extend your loyal love to Abraham, which you promised on oath to our ancestors in ancient times. Why was Micah confident in God's restoration of Israel? Because of the promise that God made to Abraham. Why was Jeremiah in Jeremiah 33 confident in God's restoration of Israel in the future? Because of the oath and promise he swore to Abraham. Can I tell you something? Why was Jeremiah able to sit and watch Jerusalem and the temple burn in 586? The entire systems that were set up to worship God are burning in front of Jeremiah. Everything is falling apart for the Jewish people, a very dark moment in the book of Lamentations. And yet there is Jeremiah at the very end of Lamentations saying what? Great is your faithfulness. Why was he able to say, as he's watching the temple burn, that your mercies are new every morning? Great is your faithfulness, because of the oath and promise that he swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It was not Abraham who walked through those pieces with God, or else that covenant would have died a long time ago. It was God alone who walked through those pieces. This is a foundational verse. Those verses I showed you in Genesis 12 and Genesis 15 are foundational to the understanding of God's prophetic word and why Israel still matters today. Look, Luke chapter 1, verses 67 through 73 is Zechariah's prayer as he sees all of these things happening, as John the Baptist is being born, as Jesus is being born. He sees all these things happening. And you know what Zechariah, John the Baptist's father, says, a priest? He says, you have remembered us, God, and the oath that you swore to our father Abraham. Jesus came as a result of God remembering, just as he spoke back in Exodus chapter 2, you are remembering the promise, the oath, the covenant you swore to our father Abraham. Jesus's birth is predicated on the promise of Abraham that goes back to Genesis chapter 12 and Genesis chapter 15. The Apostle Paul says this about Israel. I think this is fascinating, and I think one of the most important verses in understanding why God's not through with Israel and the Jewish people yet. The Apostle Paul writes this about the Jewish people, about Israel. It says this in Romans chapter 11, starting in verse 28. In regard to the gospel, the good news of Jesus, they are enemies for your sake. That's what the Apostle Paul is saying about his own people, that they are enemies of the gospel right now. And so what does he say? But in regard to election, oh, this is important. In regard to election, they are dearly loved by God. They are dearly loved for the sake of the fathers, for the gifts and call of God are irrevocable. Why? Even as they are enemies of the gospel, that's what it says. They're enemies of, that's what the Apostle Paul says about his own people. They're enemies of the gospel. But he says, you can't get rid of them, though. It's impossible. because of what happened with the fathers. Who are the fathers? Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the covenant that God made with them. Because the gifts and call of God are irrevocable. You can't break it. Why? Because of what Romans chapter 6, verse 13 says. You should go there and read it. That, you know what, when God made that covenant with Abraham, the reason he didn't walk through the pieces with Abraham and he walked through the pieces alone to make an eternal covenant, the reason that he did that was because it was such an important task, such an important part of the message of redemption, to bring redemption into the world, to make sure that all the families of the earth would be blessed. The writer of Hebrews says this in chapter 6, verse 13, that God could swear by no one greater, by nothing higher than his name alone. God essentially cursed himself by walking through those pieces alone, that if he doesn't fulfill the promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, land, descendants, blessing, then guess what? He's cursed. That's why he must fulfill the promise, because it's his name on the line. The writer of Ezekiel, the prophet Ezekiel, I had Hebrew stuck in my head, the writer of Hebrews, the prophet Ezekiel, as he's writing down the words of God, God says, I'm going to return the people of Israel to their land. I'm going to return them to their ancient homeland. And what does he say? Not because they're of their righteousness. He says, I'm about to act because of my holy reputation, my holy name. My name is connected to these people. My name is connected to this land. My name is connected to the descendants and the blessing. It has to be fulfilled, or else I'm a liar. Then I curse myself. God must fulfill the promise. Look, it's the reason why the Jewish people are still here today. It's the reason why you can come with me to Israel on one of our Up to Jerusalem tours, that you can get on an airplane and fly to Israel. An amazing thing. How in the world have Jewish people been able to return to their ancient homeland? No other people group in the entire world have ever done that before. They returned to their ancient homeland after being exiled for 2,000 years. The Jewish people should have assimilated or been annihilated thousands of years ago, and yet here they are. They've maintained an identity. They've maintained their unique connection to one another. They maintained their community, and then they went back to their ancient homeland and even resurrected a dead language, the Hebrew language. And then they were outnumbered 10 to 1 in 1948 and 1967 and 1973. Today, they were outnumbered 10 to 1. They should have been pushed into the Mediterranean Sea, and yet here they are today, a testimony not to their righteousness. That's so important. It's not because Israel is great. I was just in Jerusalem at a Christian media conference, and they had a great panel up there. And an Israeli journalist said, "Please humanize us over here in Israel. We're not that great of a group of people. Like, don't just sing our praises all the time. You can criticize us as well. Friends help friends." That's what he's trying to say. Can I tell you something? Israel is not in the land because of what Israel did and the Jewish people did. God said, I'm about to act in Ezekiel chapter 36. God promised to return the Jewish people, not because of their righteousness, but because of a promise that he made to the Jewish people that dates back to Abraham, and that through Abraham, all the families of the earth would be blessed. And I hope that if you're sitting out there right now and you're not Jewish, you're Gentile, and you believe Jesus is the Jewish Messiah, the King of Israel, the Savior of the world, the Son of God, then guess what? You've been blessed by Abraham. Abraham, through you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. This becomes foundational for why we believe Israel plays a prominent role in the prophetic future, in the events to come. Why? Because of the promise that God made to Abraham. It cannot be broken. It cannot be undone. It cannot be unraveled. It cannot be separated, because it's his name, that's an eternal name, that is connected to that promise. And that's why we believe, as the Apostle Paul says in Romans chapter 11, verses 28 and 29, that the gifts and call of God are irrevocable to Israel and the Jewish people, because of not of their righteousness. I mean, they're enemies of the gospel, but because of what? Because of the fathers, and because of the fact that God made a covenant with Abraham that cannot be broken. And can I tell you something? This is a promise that you can take to the bank. If you are a Christian and you are following the Lord and studying his word and being conformed into the image of his son, Jesus says something that is very important. I think that links to this whole idea of what it means that God walked through the pieces alone. He says, I will never leave you nor forsake you. That's a promise you can take to the bank, that God, if God can remain faithful to a people that have been unfaithful to him, how much more will he be faithful to those who follow and trust in him and trust in his promises? Look, the reason I did this is because sometimes I think when we study prophecy, we can get lost in the weeds. It's important to pull back and to see the big picture of what God is doing. This is the common thread. Look there are the verses right there. There are more. I'm only tapping into a few of them here. Most of the prophets, when they're talking about a future for Israel in the Old Testament, they are relying on that promise that God made to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12 and Genesis chapter 15. An eternal promise that cannot be broken, that becomes the foundation upon which all of this is built, even to the point that when Jesus comes, Zechariah goes, God, you remembered us. You remembered us because you're remembering the oath, the promise that you swore to our father Abraham. It's the common thread, and it binds the whole Bible together. Father, thank you that the Bible is not some haphazard book of verses that contradict one another and are at odds with one another, random stories that have no connection to each other. Instead, Lord, the scriptures span millennia with several writers, Lord, that never even met one another, from Moses to Micah, from Jonah to James in the Bible, from Peter and Paul, from all these various different writers throughout the scriptures, Lord, and yet they share the same message. There's a common thread that runs through the Bible, and it begins with Abraham and the eternal promise that you made to him. And Lord, we have been impacted by that eternal promise, because it wasn't just a promise for Abraham and his descendants. It was a promise that through Abraham, we would be blessed. All the families of the earth would be blessed. And as followers of the Lord Jesus, we have been blessed. We love you, Lord, and we ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.